Next is the library tax exemption study session. Can we please have a staff report on that?
Yes, I'm going to testing out this new microphone as well. Is it okay if I'm about this far away?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and members of the council. I am Sky Woodruff, your city attorney. I am presenting tonight because I took a significant role in preparing the report because there's a lot of legal interpretation to be done in providing this report. I do want to thank Aisa Shuri for working with a consultant to obtain the demographic and housing data that's included in the report, and to Holly and Alex for their help in putting it together as well. So jumping right in. See, there we go. So on March 3rd, City Council asked for this study session to have an opportunity to receive more information about the exemptions that are included in Measure C and the options for potential additional exemptions if Council was interested in implementing those. Measure C does contain an exemption. It states in part that, and I think what the exemption that is probably most relevant to this discussion is the one that is quoted here on the slide. And it states that a property will be exempt if one of the owners qualifies for participation in either or both of two programs that are listed in that provision of the ordinance. One of them, the Gonzalez-Duke-Magee and Petra Senior Citizen Property Tax Assistance Law, it is not currently being implemented because the state has not provided funding for it. The Senior Citizen Property Tax Postponement Law is in effect and has existing criteria that can be used for reference for the exemption that is included in Measure C. And I want to emphasize, and did on the slide, that it states that one of the owners must qualify for participation, not that they must actually participate in the program. This language is substantially the same as is in the current parks special tax and was in the swim center special tax and was carried forward when that was renewed. I know there's been some question about the application of that exemption. City staff have reviewed the files to the extent that they can and found that no one has ever actually applied for this exemption for the swim center or the parks tax. If the city received an application, it would process it. But having been city attorney for quite a while, been aware of this as a possibility, I have always interpreted this language to mean that somebody would have to meet the criteria of one of these programs, not that they would actually have to participate. There are a number of criteria, but I've just listed two of the ones that I think are the most important. And that is that the participant must be at least 62 years of age or blind or disabled and have an annual household income of $55,181 or less. So there are other factors, but those are the ones that are probably the most relevant for this exemption. This is written into the ordinance. If Measure C passes in June, this will be implemented. If the city will set up a process for receiving applications. If there are applications, the city will process them. But as I will discuss later on, one of the things that is an option for the council is to, if there are questions in council's mind about whether or not one has to participate in the Senior Citizen Property Tax Postponement Law or simply meet the criteria to qualify to participate, that is an option for council, and I'll cover the provisions of the ordinance that provide that authority. Can you go to the next slide? I think it's not quite working.
Can you turn it on? It's on this side.
Oh, now it's on. Okay, thank you. All right, great. Next, I just want to turn to what is built into the ordinance that would authorize the city council to adopt additional exemptions if it wanted to. The primary provision is one that states the city council may enact any other amendments, including but not limited to amendments necessary to implement or administer the special tax. So to me, this is clear authority for the city council to amend the ordinance to add additional exemptions if it chooses to. There are some limits on that authority, however. These limits are both in the ordinance and in the California Constitution. These are provisions that were originally added by Proposition 218 and left in place when those were amended by Proposition 26. And they are that council can't tax someone who is exempt according to the express terms of Measure C. City Council can't amend the Measure C to tax beyond the rates that are authorized in the measure, and council can't extend the term of the tax beyond the automatic sunset that's included. The measure also states that that council may not adopt amendments that would frustrate the purpose of Measure C, and I would say that the two primary purposes are finance a new library and pay for 10 years of the city's costs of operating the library after it has opened. So any amendment that would frustrate those purposes is potentially prohibited even though the ordinance provides authority for council to adopt additional exemptions, those exemptions cannot frustrate the purposes of the measure. Additionally, the tax states that as we went over when we presented the 9212 report, the ordinance has two different ways of limiting the taxes that council can ultimately impose annually. But it also says that city council may, by resolution, increase or decrease the rate of the special tax below those limits. An exemption is, in effect, a decision to set the tax rate at 0 for a class of taxpayers. And so I would take this as additional authority for the city council to adopt exemptions as long as those are below the maximums, which they would be by definition since the rate would be 0. Finally, coming back to council's ability to clarify things regarding the exemption that is built into the ordinance, the ordinance states that the council may by resolution interpret the ordinance for purposes of clarifying any vagueness or ambiguity. So to me, that would include clarifying whether an applicant for an exemption must actually participate in one of those two state programs or if it's sufficient for them to meet the qualifications. Also other clarifications that could potentially expand the scope of the exemption somewhat, but not narrow them. I just wanted to stress again that there are these limits on council's ability to adopt the exemptions. In addition to the ones that are in the Constitution, they can't frustrate the purposes of the measure, which to me would include exempting so many properties that it would basically be unable to fund the construction of a new library or finance 10 years of library services by the city. With that said, the council has a lot of options. It could just clarify the ambiguities. It could adopt an age-based exemption. It could add an income-based exemption. It could add an exemption based on both age and income. For any of these options, it could also layer disability into them, since the one exemption that is built into the ordinance includes not just individuals over the age of 62, but also individuals who are blind or disabled. And then the city does have a scholarship program for participation in recreation programs. And we just included those in the report for council to consider because it's an existing program. I've included a table that tries to summarize the various options that were presented in the report. So what I looked at is what is the nature of the exemption? What criteria could be used? How many households would potentially be eligible to participate? And then what would be the potential revenue impacts? So and this is all based on the data that was included in the report. I do have those on separate slides, so I can pull them up if council is interested in looking at those. But if council adopted an age-only exemption that exempted a household if at least one of the owners was at least 60 years of age, that would make 3,271 households eligible. If all of them applied and were granted exemptions, that would reduce revenue by just over $1 million, which is about a third of all overall revenue and half of the owner-occupied revenue. And I used 60 years of age because that's just the bands of age that we received from the consultant for demographic data. If council instead wanted to look at an income-only exemption, If it exempted households with income less than $50,000, that would be 673 households, which would reduce revenue by about $222,000. And I should say that I'm coming up with these numbers because if you'll recall from the 9212 report, the city's financial advisor calculated that the average parcel would pay $331 in the first year. So I just used those numbers to create this table. If the income only exemption were for households of $75,000 or less, that would be 1,187 households. Potential revenue loss would be $393,000 almost, which would be 12.4% of all revenue. So coming to age and income together, the consultants were not able to find a data source in the time available that included household data by age and income, and also differentiated between owner-occupied households and renter households. All they could provide us was combined owner-occupied and renter. I included the data because I wanted council to be able to at least consider this. We could make we could speculate about what the impacts of such an exemption would be. So I just provided a few different scenarios in the report. Councilmember Motoyama asked a good question, which I've clarified here in the report, and I'll get to that. So let's say that council adopted an age and income exemption for households where at least one owner was at least 65 years of age and household income was less than $50,000. So we know that there are 881 households in El Cerrito that would meet those criteria. We don't know whether or not they are owner occupied or renters. We do know from the income data that there are 673 households that are owner occupied and have income less than $50,000. So we could infer that probably the age and income based exemption would have fewer households than 673. I didn't include that in the report just because I didn't want to make that inference and make it something where I couldn't say with certainty. All I knew for certain was we know that there are 881. That would result in a loss of about $291,000 of revenue, which is about 9.2%. 673 would be 223, almost 7%. And then if you use the same factors, but then increase the annual income to a household income of less than $75,000, the numbers jump up to a maximum of just over $1,300. If you're using the all households, if you use the income number from above, it drops down to 1,187. But in either case, you're looking at over $400,000 or almost $400,000 in revenue reduction, which is between 12.4 and 13.7% of revenue anticipated in the first year. So that's a summary of some options that we identified for council and the potential impacts of them. I'll leave this slide up if it's as a reference. And as I said, I did include slides that have the data tables from the report, so I can pull any of those up if council is interested in reviewing those.
Okay, thanks, Guy. We'll start over here to my right. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Sky, for this presentation. I know you were able to pull this together very quickly. Is there a basis for the HRA income level, the 55,812? What is that?
That number is actually established in the revenue and taxation code provisions that set that law. That is actually, although that's not the HRA, that is the senior citizens tax exemption law. I forget the exact name, but that's in the revenue and taxation code. They set a number and then it adjusts annually, basically by a CPI factor.
So that we wouldn't have to figure it out every year. We can just look it up and that it will automatically factor inflation in.
Exactly. And as long as the program remains in effect, the Finance Tax Board will adjust the number and we'll just be able to look to them to do the adjustment.
Okay. I think, just to clarify what you said about the people that have not applied for this exemption for the pool. And so I just want to make sure that it's not that nobody qualified. It's just that nobody applied.
As far as the staff has been able to identify, and they did actually search records, there is no record of anyone having applied. If someone had applied, I believe that that this way the city would have interpreted and evaluated the application. And again, similar wording in the swim center tax and the parks tax is would have looked to the criteria in the state programs and said, these are the criteria for qualification for this exemption. We don't care whether or not you actually participate in the program. We just look at those criteria.
Okay.
But we've never had an opportunity to do so because no one has applied as far as we can tell.
Okay. And sorry, I'm losing track of my question. It's getting late for me. So the age and income based exemption total revenue loss of 281,000 is greater than the income based exemption of 222,763. So can you explain that again? Or was that what you were trying to get at when you showed the chart?
I'm happy to explain it again. So when I put together the report, all we knew was there were 881 households with one owner who is at least 60 or one occupant who is at least 65 years of age. And there's a household income of less than $50,000. What I said is, well, we know that number. We know that if the council adopted that exemption and just said those are the two criteria, and every household in El Cerrito that meets those two criteria applied, we know that the total number of households would be less than 881 because some of those are renters and they would not qualify. They're not subject to the tax. I didn't want to speculate about the number, so I just quoted that and tried to explain in the report. This is the theoretical maximum. We know it would be less. I think you made a very good point, which is, well, since it's the same income threshold as you've identified for the income only exemption idea, isn't really the maximum 673, and I think that's a very fair inference. I just didn't want to make it in the report, but I've included it here because I think it's a very fair question. We still know that 670, if we make that inference, 673 would still be the maximum. We know that that reality is that there are fewer households than that because that 673 also probably includes renters.
Thank you for clarifying that. And then in terms of kind of administrative time, city manager, what do you think, in terms of doing this annually?
Sure. And I think there's another thing that's important to understand with this exemption, even as it currently is written. This is not an automatic exemption. It needs to be applied for, and it needs to be applied for every year. So for example, if someone, lost their job or something, I mean, they could maybe be, eligible one year and maybe not the next. So we know that even this, I think it's great that we are kind of looking at what the, I guess, worst case scenario might be, if you will, as far as if every single person eligible, to the extent that we know, it's kind of impossible to know what that actually means, because even if there are at the very max, 1,300 people that apply for this or that are eligible, they may or may not apply, no matter how much we broadly advertise it. And that's just the reality of it. As far as administrative, we have certainly at this point, because there hasn't been anyone that has applied, we don't have a specific application created at this point. We certainly could easily do that. We do have technology, particularly when it comes to things like our business licenses or our rental inspection program, where we would be able to leverage something like that, an online form or a form that someone could come in and fill out easily, to be able to manage that. It's really hard to say depending on how many people would actually want to take advantage of this. But if it was a large amount, we would look to something hopefully technologically available to us that we could either with our current software, we would look to something else through any other cities that may do things like this. I will say that we do accept applications for the David Hunter Scholarship. So we do, this isn't completely foreign to us to be able to handle some of these things administratively. I think the answer would depend on volume. And at this point, again, if someone wanted to qualify for the programs that are currently in Measure H, at this point, if they sent a letter or an email to me or to the finance department inquiring, we would be able to work on that criteria. But it could be something easy like upload documentation to this website and we could review it. And would it take staff time? Yes. But I think that we could probably, depending on volume, easily use technology to try to reduce that burden.
Okay. And my last question is about income of the individual versus the total income of the household. So the way that we're looking at this is the person who is 65 years or older is just one member of an entire household. In determining the eligibility, you're looking at the income of the entire household.
That's correct. The way that we would implement the exemption that is built into Measure C is that one member of the household who is an owner of the property would need to be at least 62 years of age, and household income would have to be less than that 55,100 threshold. So we look at age of one of the owners, but we would look at household income.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Councilmember Casanas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a few questions. Going back to the criteria of the 62 years old or blind or disabled and income, am I understanding correctly that this council has the option of maybe directing it towards not having to be a combined all of those? We could just single out age or single out income. Is that accurate?
The exemption that is built into the ordinance would have to remain in place. You cannot nullify that, but the council could say, in addition to that, anybody who is a homeowner and has household income of less than $50,000 will also be exempt. There will obviously be some overlap between the two, but it would be treated as a separate exemption in addition to the one that's built into the ordinance.
Okay, thank you. And then when the Gonzalez-Dugmasian, law, I guess, came about, and I started hearing that it wasn't funded, and I started wondering what that meant. And one of the questions I had, and I think I know the answer, is that when it was funded, if it was implemented, if say the city was using it as a criteria and someone was in that program, we would have been reimbursed for that lost revenue. Is that accurate?
Probably yes. So but I don't know for sure because I didn't take an incredibly deep dive into how the program was implemented at the time. But as I understood it, and hopefully I'm getting this correct, it was unlike the other law, which basically exempts from the payment of property tax. The other program was a tax reimbursement. And so as long as the city's parcel tax, the Measure C tax, was encompassed within the state's definition of parcel tax, the state would have reimbursed them for the tax that they paid. So they would have paid the tax and then they would have gotten reimbursed for it.
So theoretically, if it was funded and someone applied and actually applied to that program and was accepted into that program, we could be reimbursed.
Yes.
Okay.
If it exists again.
If it exists.
Yes.
Okay.
If it was funded again in the future, that's correct.
Okay. And if it's a law and it's simply not funded, does that just negate the law?
The statute still exists. I didn't look into the minutiae of how this all came about, but at some point in time, the program existed and was funded by the legislature. And then at some legislative cycle, the legislature stopped providing the funding for it. And so the law remains in effect. As far as I know, it has not been repealed. There is simply no funding available to the state division that would have provided would have operated the program and provided the reimbursement.
Okay. I don't remember exactly where it is, but somewhere in your write-up and in the ordinance, there's mention of no none of the revenue from the bond sale can go towards staff costs. Is there a distinction between something that causes staff to use their time, as the city manager was talking about, the staff hours to coordinate the exemptions, and something that actually taxes staff costs? Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm thinking that
Right.
you're maybe not having to pay staff because of something directly, but you're indirectly having to use staff hours. And is there a distinction between that?
But it would not be funded by any of the Measure C funds. So staff would be perhaps increasing their hours or increasing their work, but it would not, no staff, administrative staff, city staff would be able to be funded by this measure.
Even if their
So
hours are
the measure funding would go into a completely separate fund. It would not be allowed to reimburse the general fund for any of staff's time. It could be used to pay for the library hours, which is in effect the county's staff. So I also want to make sure that there's a distinction there, that the county only pays for a baseline of hours. Any additional hours we pay for. Right now, we are currently paying for it out of our general fund. If there's money available this way, we could use this funding to pay for those additional library hours or any of the additional maintenance costs, as the measure describes, for the first 10 years.
And I just add that also one of the provisions of Measure C is that as part of the city's annual audit, the auditors must do a separate report on the money into that special fund and money out of that special fund. That would go to a citizens oversight committee, and that report would detail whether or not any of the funding came out of the special fund and into the general fund to reimburse for administration salaries.
Yeah, and that would appear each year in an annual comprehensive financial.
Even if someone's hours are redirected towards that, that's not considered funding of it then.
Correct. We could not use any of this library restricted funding to be able to reimburse any city staff costs of any. I mean, that's forbidden. So it's just like with our other parcel taxes that are restricted, we are not allowed to do that either. So anything that's paid, any staff that when we are paid, each of our paychecks, if you will, or any of our budget line items are very clear about which funds pay for salaries, and this would not have any city salaries attached to it, nor would it be allowed to be transferred into the general fund for reimbursement of staff. That would be completely forbidden.
Okay, and thank you. And I have a concern, and I want to make sure I understand it correctly. In the write-up, the city attorney's write-up, page 76, for what it's worth, 76 of the agenda packet. I'll read the sentence. It says, council may not eliminate or modify the exemptions expressly stated in the measure such that qualifying property owners would pay tax or additional tax. And I interpret that to mean that it can't be modified in such a way that it shifts the burden in a sense and raises other people's taxes.
Yes. So it means two things. It means that, and I would say it means something in addition. So one way to look at it is the exemption says that an owner who was over 62 and under the income threshold pays zero tax. The council can't modify the exemption to say, well, they pay half the tax. So that's one of the ways that the city cannot modify it. But additionally, as we talked about during the when council received the 9212 report, there are two provisions of the ordinance that limit the tax rates. One is there's just a cap, and that inflates annually. And then additionally, council cannot set rates annually at amounts that would result in revenue that exceeds 115% of the costs to pay for debt service and the authorized uses of the revenue. So those are ultimately the caps on the rate. If council grants an exemption to a new exemption to one set of property owners, it can't then try to make up the revenue from other taxpayers who are not exempt if the rates would go over those caps.
So what I don't understand is what if the cap isn't an issue? What if you're below the cap? And so you're not pushing the 17 cents, you're not pushing the 115%. And you have a certain need for funds to pay back the bonds. It seems to me that, say it's a pie and you have 100 participants in the pie, everyone's going to have equal share. And if suddenly you have, 95 people in the pie, everyone's piece of the pie that they have to contribute does go up. It seems like in my mind, it seems impossible to give an exemption without that rolling over to be, maybe a minimal, but some impact on the other people who are paying the tax in order to get what you need.
Yes. So if council determined that in any year they were going to go, so let's say, for example, in any given year, the 115% was always below the 17 cents, to use your example. And council was always going to set rates to the 115%, so the maximum that they possibly could. And an additional exemption was reducing revenue to some degree. Council does have the ability to set the rates to go up to the 115%, but that's you could look at that as increasing rates for some because of the exemption for others. Right. I think that's a fair way to look at it. Another way to look at it is council's just always taxing those who are subject to the tax to ensure that there's 115% of the revenue that's necessary.
And I would even go further as to say that if we would, again, this would have to depend on when we received applications and learning if there was how many there may or may not be, depending on when we actually go out for the bonds, that we would have to calculate all of that we would calculate all of that ahead of time, because to your point, if we're taking out a mortgage essentially to build a building, we need to make sure that we're making that minimum payment. And so in order to do that, I think that we would try to account for that before we went out for the bond, so that we wouldn't ever come to, the last thing we would want is go, oh my gosh, we're not going to have enough money to pay our payment. We would never put ourselves into that position. We would do that at the outset, and we would calculate any of those scenarios to begin with.
And my question isn't based out of a concern of hitting the top and not having enough money. It's more, if I understand that language to be that you can't have an exemption that increases the tax on someone else, it just seems like that's what an exemption does.
Well, let me take a different example then. Let's say that the debt service plus the cost of library services was in every year well below the 115% cap. Mm-hmm. As long as other than paying the debt service, council has flexibility to say we're not going to increase the rates on others to be able to finance the exemption. You could just say we're just going to have to use general fund dollars to pay for library services rather than that.
But not an obligation to, though, right? It's a choice.
It's a choice other than the debt service. Once the bonds are issued, you got to generate enough revenue to pay for that, plus an additional percentage that the trustees will build into the bond documents to ensure that there's sufficient buffer. But other than that, council has options to generate less than the maximum amount of revenue and thereby not increase rates for other owners because it has basically created a new exemption.
Okay.
It is a choice for the council.
Okay.
But there are of course consequences for those choices.
Yeah.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem Saltzman, and then Councilmember Weisinger.
Thank you for asking about that. And just to clarify a little bit further, so this is about us establishing new exemptions, but the exemption that's already in there, it's already in there. So this doesn't apply. We still have the cap that's there no matter what. Okay.
Correct.
Just wanted to clarify that. I think most of my questions have been answered already. Thanks to my colleagues for asking so many great questions. I am inclined at this point, and I know we're not voting tonight, but we're potentially going to bring it back. I think we should clarify the included exemption, because there is a lot of mistrust and misinformation out there. And I think we should just clarify that whatever is going on with these state programs, it doesn't matter. This is going to be our process. We're going to go to what we think it says in the measure, even if these state programs are defunct, and we should make it very clear that it's based on, the age or being blind or disabled and having a certain income. So I think we should just make that super clear so people know exactly what they're voting on. So that's where I'm inclined to go at this point.
Okay, Councilmember Weisinger.
Yes, I actually didn't have any major comments similar to what Councilmember Salzman said. My colleagues have covered a lot of it, especially the question about the people who have been approved versus how people who have applied. So thank you so much for that, Sky. And yes, I'm complete.
I just want to make one quick follow-up to Councilman Salzman's request. I think it would also be helpful to clarify what qualifying means and to make it clear that it's qualifying in the eyes of the city and not of those programs.
Yes, I think if that was the direction from council, we'd come back with a resolution basically expressing the policy of the council to interpret this existing exemption to state that the city will treat an applicant as qualifying for an exemption from the city's tax if they meet these criteria that are set out in the state law.
Okay, good. Now we'll go to open comment. Now is the time for members of the public who wish to provide public comments on this item. Requests to speak can be submitted to the city clerk by completing a speaker card, using the raise hand feature on Zoom, or dialing 9 if joining by phone. In-person requests will be taken first. Please remember to identify yourself and your city of residence at the beginning of your comments. Madam City Clerk, please proceed.
Thank you, Mayor. Still getting used to the, we have 5 requests to speak at this time. So we'll start with our in-person requests. Susan Obayashi, followed by Bill Barish.
Good evening.
Hi, good evening. My name's Susan Obayashi, and I live in El Cerrito. Wanted to speak about the wording of Measure C regarding this tax exemption for senior citizens. The way it is currently presented in the measure is absolutely misleading because of the one fund, which is has been unfunded since 2010, and that the other exemption is only a postponement of the tax. It's not an erasure of the tax for that person who qualifies. There'll be a lien placed against that person's property to be collected when the owner no longer resides there or refinances or sells. I think misleading the residents of El Cerrito continues to destroy the trust we have in our city management and government. And then I do have a question. If the city council were to make the resolutions about any or some or all of the exemptions that were presented by Mr. Woodruff this evening, how long is the resolution good for? Is it good for that tax year, a calendar year? Would it have to be re-voted on every time, like every year by city council, or when new city council members are elected? Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Bill Barish, followed by Michael Fisher.
Good evening again. A couple of quick questions. So if more property owners were to qualify for the exemptions, whether the stated exemptions in the initiative or the ones the council creates or whatever that happens to be, then the initiative allows for that would be allowable without disrupting the goal of the measure. How would the city determine the winners and losers of the exemption? Is this a coin flip, or time frame? What's the criteria here? And the second question is, have you looked at those applications papers and the renewal processes for any of the proposed exemptions to understand and determine why no one has ever applied for any of them from the previous Measure H? If you haven't looked into that, there must be something going on that we haven't heard about. And I think it would be incredibly important for voters to know about this before they went to the polls. And it's a daylighting of information that is currently under wraps. And so I would encourage the city attorney to look at those and decide and determine what is it that is keeping people from going ahead to apply for those exemptions. There must be something about them that makes it particularly difficult and unattractive. So those are the things that I think we need to determine as well as on top of what Ms. Obayashi just said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michael Fisher, followed by Michelle Fideli.
Good evening again. I'm Michael Fisher. I've lived in El Cerrito since 1998. It's good to see the city attorney's report stating that the council may provide for a senior exemption beyond what is written in Measure C. As one of the people involved in the drafting of that measure, my intent, despite what I think others sometimes imply, was to have an appropriate exemption. As a volunteer on policy matters with AARP, I know there are seniors who struggle with expenses and that appropriate senior exemptions are one way these needs can be addressed. That's what we intended. The decisions on senior exemptions involves complex balancing between relief to those seniors most needing it and ensuring that the funding provided by the tax is sufficient. That is why we have a city council and a city administration, and I trust the decision to them. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michelle Fideli, and then we'll go to our online request for Irish Share now.
Good evening, Michelle Fideli again, El Cerrito. I just want to say I appreciate all of the questions tonight. I think that will, I have to say, help you all clarify the measure and make it fair. I just, in looking at the chart that we had up with the percentages and the dollar amounts, just wanted to suggest that you give yourselves another option. So instead of reaching $50,000 or $75,000 and it's an absolute zero, perhaps after some number it's graduated. So maybe after $50,000, the next set, instead of getting a zero exemption, maybe it is 50% or something else, so that you know, someone's not missing the opportunity by $1 or get it going up to the $75,000 limit. We're not losing so much, just to give yourself some options. And just wanted to say, for anyone else that has additional questions on Measure C after this evening, I neglected to mention that there are 8 sessions planned for a Q&A. It's open to anyone who would like to ask. It's they're listed 6 online and 2 in person, listed on the website, elcerritolibrary.com under events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll go to our online request to speak. Ira, you should be able to unmute and begin your time now.
Ira Sharonell, El Cerrito. The city attorney, Sky Woodruff, does not work for the city. His firm, Redwood Public Law, is hired on a contract basis at rates of $363 to $442 per hour, from what I could tell. My estimate, and is only an estimate, is that between the attorney and the economic consulting firm, Strategic Economics, this single agenda item likely costs taxpayers $8,000 to $12,000. I was able to reproduce the data in the study in 1 hour with the help of Claude, which charges $20 a month. Now, here is an extremely important point that needs to be emphasized. The numbers in the report are not counts. They're not exact numbers. Instead, they are estimates. That is a critical difference. And with estimates come plausible ranges. In this case, the Census Bureau gives very wide ranges. So the data as presented is essentially useless for the purpose of policy. By the way, the census data is available free online for anyone who actually knows how to use it. I point out that the city clerk refused to provide the data that determined the possible revenue, so that number is open to question. The city has also failed to provide information on the average cost, or the average amount, the average cost to the taxpayer. The current numbers are significantly different than previous numbers provided by the city, so every number is open to question. I suggest the council also consider the exemptions in the West Contra Costa Unified School District parcel tax, which is far more generous than anything you're considering. I suggest that the council look at the livable El Cerrito article on how staff can get paid with Measure C funding, thus contradicting what the city manager just said. I thought this was settled months ago. So I think everything is open to question. And I think you need much better information, more clarity. And I think the city needs to have a public forum in which the council engages with the public and stops stonewalling them. Thank you very much.
Mayor, that concludes the request to speak on this item.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll bring it back to the council. Any final thoughts, any more instructions you'd like to give? Councilmember Motiama.
Thank you, Mayor. I think, I really would like to see us staying with the qualifications of the tax postponement law. Not that it would be a postponement, it would be an exemption, but I think that, somebody thought about all these things and it's already there. And I think that those are all pretty reasonable things, like not having a reverse mortgage, having a household income that's set at 55,181 or less, have 40% equity in the property. I mean, those are all things that, have clearly been worked out as appropriate to determine that there is an exemption. So I would like us to kind of keep that in mind as kind of the template. I think, once, as one of the members of the public mentioned, who's going to be the winners and losers. I think that that's really not what this exemption is about. I think it's really, for fixed income seniors for whom that this tax may be a hardship. So I want to not lose track of what we're trying to do. And huge is something that's been tested. Thank you.
Okay. We'll go here to Mayor Potem. Did you have any? Okay. Any other?
Yeah, I want to thank you. I want to follow up on something that Councilmember Montiyama mentioned. With the 40% equity and reverse mortgage criteria, what I saw in that was because it was a deferral and they wanted to get paid back, that was a way to make sure that that borrower had the resources to pay back. But if we're genuinely doing an exemption, we're not getting paid back. So it strikes me that the reverse mortgage clause and the 40% equity clause shouldn't apply.
I think that's up to council. I think that you could for the purposes of implementation of the exemption that is in the ordinance, since this would broaden the exemption rather than narrow it, you could eliminate those additional factors and condense it down to one of the owners is at least 62 and the household income is no more than the whatever the amount is that's calculated by the FTB using the statute currently 55,181. Okay. The other factors I think are relevant to the postponement law, but not necessarily relevant to the city's implementation of an exemption. And so if council were okay with dispensing with those other factors, and ultimately you wanted to give the direction to adopt a resolution, we could just excise those and say that the exemption would be available to anybody just based on the age and income factors.
And is just to the city manager and yourself, is the time to have a resolution towards that now, or does it come later if it passes and deal with it then, or what's optimal? I mean, I imagine it really requires more thought, so it's not piecemeal.
Correct. If based on direction tonight, we could bring back a resolution at the next city council meeting. I think I heard a couple of council members talking about wanting to have clarity for the voters, if you will. Again, knowing that this isn't a city written ordinance, so we are interpreting, right? So being able to interpret the way we did in the 9212 impact report, for example, and with this type of resolution, I think it would at least provide the intent of the council. I will also say that, and I did hear a question about what that resolution would mean. Resolutions are legislation of the city council. They are in effect until they are repealed by the council. So as long as this resolution is passed by the city council, it stays in effect as long as the council intends to keep it there. You could override it, you could repeal it, but once it's passed, it is the legislation of the city.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, Councilmember Weisinger, do you have any final? Do you have any final comments or instructions?
No, I am complete.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Katsanis, for bringing that up. I think that's a fair point, and I would be in favor of striking those two parts, the 40% equity and not having a reverse mortgage. I also think it would reduce the burden on staff, because if you have, like 5 different documents at least that you have to confirm and make sure they're valid documents, that's a lot more work. So the fewer things, and I think the other qualifications are much more significant in identifying. I mean, you might not have 40% equity because you are in financial problems, and those are the people we're trying to help. So I think for a lot of reasons, I'm okay with striking those and would like to see a version come back with those struck from it. The other thing I just want to mention, yes, a city council in the future could change what we approve, but our staff and our attorney have already told us that almost no matter what the council does, the staff is going to interpret it at least in this way. Maybe then those parts that we have struck, if we strike them, would come back. But the income, the age, that is what you would go on, not based on whether the state law was happening or not. Correct?
Correct.
So kind of doesn't matter what a future city council does, you would still interpret it that way. And so I just want to make sure, because again, there's been so much confusion, so many different stories about this measure. So I just want to make sure we're clear when we vote on this next time, that this is what the council intends, but a future council can't get rid of the exemption. And so I want to make that super clear to people as they go out and decide how to vote on this measure.
No, I completely agree with Councilmember Casanas and the Mayor Pro Tem on striking the 2 points. So I wanted to check with City Manager and City Attorney. Do you have enough instructions? Do we have to vote on this, or?
What I've heard is a consensus from council to bring back a resolution that would articulate the policy of council to clarify that the exemption that is already included in Measure C does not require participation in either of the 2 state programs that are identified, that instead the city will be using the criteria of those, but deleting the criteria that for the senior citizen property tax postponement law that would require at least 40% equity and not having a reverse mortgage, those would be deleted. So the only criteria that council would be using from that program are that one of the owners must be at least 62 years of age, blind, or disabled, that they own the property as their principal place of residence, and that they have a total household income of $55,181 or less, but that's the current amount we'd roll in the criteria. So basically, it will be council's policy that would be sufficient to qualify for an exemption from the Measure C tax, and that would be the resolution that we brought back.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Next, we will go to city